It's a pleasure this afternoon to welcome Julie Dobro back to the Historical Society. I think many of you know of her earlier book, After Emily, Two Remarkable Women, and the legacy of America's greatest poet, about Emily Dickinson and the editorial work that went on behind the scenes. That book was published in 2018. And Julie has been back at work on her new book, which is Crossing Indian Country from the Wounded Knee Massacre to the Unlikely Marriage of Elaine Goodale and Charles Alexander Eastman. Eastman was a Sioux Indian who became a medical doctor, an author and lecturer, and an activist on Native American affairs. He and his wife, Elaine Goodman, lived in Amherst from 1903 to 1921. During that time, Eastman lectured about 25 times a year across the country, and he published 8 books while she published 3, so a very prolific couple. And I have a feeling there's some wonderful local history behind their relationship and their activities. So it's a pleasure to welcome Julie back to Amherst, and also to welcome her son, who's a student at Amherst College. Please welcome Julie.
Thank you so much. It is so wonderful to be physically back in Amherst to give this talk today. As many of you know, between the research for my last book, friends and relatives in the area, and of course my son at Amherst College, for a long time I felt like I was practically commuting between my home and here, and I've missed my regular trips along routes 2 and 202. So I am delighted to be speaking with you today, but not about the Todds and the Dickinsons, but this time about another fascinating family that did live in Amherst for a number of years. Elaine Goodale Eastman and her husband, Ohiesa, or Charles Alexander Eastman. However, as you will see, there are some strange connections and crossovers even here. I just can't get away from the Todds. I first became aware of Elaine Goodale during the summer of 1980 when I had a job working at the Sophia Smith Women's History Archive in Northampton. They had recently received some new papers from the Goodale Dayton family, which had not been cataloged, and it was my job to start sorting them. An amazing story leapt off the pages of these yellowing letters, fragile albums, and brittle newspaper clippings. And pretty soon, I was entranced. I wrote my senior thesis about Elaine. I tracked down and met with 2 of her surviving daughters, both of whom lived in Northampton. I wrote a number of articles about her, and then I went on to do a bunch of other things. But when I found myself rooting around for the topic of my next biography, I kept finding myself drawn back to the Eastmans. And so, even though my then agent and then editor urged me to work on someone more famous, I decided that I wasn't done with the Eastmans, not yet. And that now, with training in anthropology, sociology, and history, with professional experience writing both journalism and biography, and with the personal lived experience of having been a mother who constantly juggled her family and her career, I felt better prepared to take on the very complicated story and lives of both Elaine and Charles Eastman. So what I'd like to do this afternoon is to tell you a little bit about both Elaine and Charles's early lives and about their first decade or so together as a couple, and then focus on the years that they lived in Amherst between 1903 and 1921. This period of time was a profound one for them, both in terms of their respective careers and also in terms of their marriage. Ohiesa was born in 1858 near present-day Redwood Falls, Minnesota. His parents, Wakandiota, or Many Lightnings, Santee, Dakota, and Wakantakowin, or Winona, also known as Mary Nancy Eastman, had 4 older children before their youngest son arrived. Many Lightnings was descended from a long line of chiefs. Winona was the only child to come from the union of Wakan-Inanzinawan, stand sacred, a Dakota daughter of the chief Cloudman, who was one of the earliest Sioux to convert to Christianity, and Captain Seth Eastman, a West Point-trained U.S. Army officer and artist stationed in Minnesota. He would later desert his daughter and her mother for a white woman, also named Mary, who he also married. Sadly, Winona died shortly after her last child's birth, leaving the baby, called Hakada, or pitiful last due to his mother's fate, to be brought up by her husband's family. The late 1850s was a tumultuous time for the Santee Sioux. White settlers were pouring into the areas that they had traditionally occupied. In the late 1850s, the Minnesota Territory filled with more than 150,000 white settlers. The Sioux's territory shrunk. Their way of life irrevocably changed. The set of treaties they continued to make with Euro-Americans were systematically broken. To make matters worse, the Euro-Americans tried to force the Sioux to give up hunting and take up farming, but their crops failed, annuities were delayed, and the Sioux were plunged into poverty and starvation. Euro-Americans also almost extinguished the bison, upon whom the Sioux depended for much of their livelihood. This, in turn, further depressed Sioux autonomy and made them progressively more economically dependent upon the U.S. government. And they effectively became wards of a state they never sought to be part of. By 1862, the situation became so desperate that some Sioux began raiding Euro-American farms and stores. In response, the U.S. Army initiated a truly overdetermined response and began raiding Sioux villages. General John Pope, the commander in charge, was determined to, quote, utterly eliminate the Sioux. Hakada's family fled along with other Santee. They traveled precariously to Manitoba. There, the young boy was told that his father and older brothers had been killed in the melee. He was raised by his grandmother and uncle and received his second name, Ohiesa, or the winner, when he was a teenager who had demonstrated his athletic prowess. This story and others about his early years were told by Charles in his first book, Indian Boyhood. One day, after he'd turned 15, he returned back from a hunting trip to find a couple of unfamiliar men. They were Sioux, but dressed in white man's clothing. He learned that one of them was actually his father, Many Lightnings. As it turned out, he had been imprisoned, not killed. And during his confinement, after being pardoned and saved from a mass hanging on the order of President Abraham Lincoln, he'd become convinced that the only path forward for the Sioux was to take up some of the white man's ways. So Many Lightnings became Jacob Eastman. He became a Christian. He cut his hair and took up farming in Flandreau, South Dakota. He'd come to Canada to reclaim his youngest son and insisted that young Ohiesa also learn English and get a Euro-American education. Ohiesa, now Charles Alexander Eastman, proved a brilliant student who studied at a number of preparatory schools. His white mentors saw great promise for the young man to become a, quote, model for his people. His educational path eventually led him to Dartmouth College, where he excelled at sports, got a broad liberal arts education, and earned his undergraduate degree. And then went on to Boston University Medical School. By the time he graduated in 1890, he was already one of the best-known Native Americans in the United States between his educational credentials, his excellent public speaking skills, and his good looks that were frequently captured in photographs that appeared in newspapers of the day. After some astute politicking, Charles eventually landed a position with the Indian Service as an agency physician. Determined to give back to his people, he traveled from Boston to Pine Ridge in the newly declared state of South Dakota in the late fall of 1890. Elaine Goodale was born in 1863 on the elegiacally named Sky Farm. Nestled in a remote corner of the Massachusetts Berkshires, Sky Farm was aptly named. The morning mists hugged the hills and fields, diminishing the boundary between earth and sky, creating an almost cosmic feeling of unity. Transcendentalist writers like Emerson and Thoreau traveled to nearby Bashfish Falls and wrote ecstatically of the area's somehow otherworldly and inspirational beauty. Sky Farm itself felt insulated from the rest of humanity. The nearest neighbor was more than 4 miles away. Because both of Elaine's parents were interested in poetry, Elaine and her younger sister Dora began composing their own poems as young children. I used to make up verses and croon them to myself sometime before it occurred to me to commit them to odd scraps of paper, Elaine wrote in her unpublished memoir. When she was 7 and Dora 4, they began to write a magazine they called The Child's Monthly Gem, which transformed into Sky Farm life when they were a bit older. The Goodale parents shared these hand-printed magazines with family friends. The positive reaction they received encouraged Elaine's father, Henry Sterling Goodale, to share his daughter's poetry more widely. The dissemination of the poetry meant that it was eventually sent to Mary Mapes Dodge, editor of St. Nicholas Magazine, a very successful children's magazine, which had a circulation of over 70,000 in the late 19th century. The reaction to these poems, published in 1877, was incredible to the Goodales. Fan mail began pouring into Sky Farm, including letters from noted literary figures of the day, like Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who at the time was also very busily advising another young poet from Western Massachusetts, whom you all know. Reaction to the girls' poetry also led to a book of collected poems, Apple Blossoms, published in 1878. It was a huge hit, selling 10,000 copies and earning strong critical acclaim. The success of this book led to several other volumes of poetry by the girls and led them to become known as the, quote, genius childhood poetic prodigies of the Berkshires. Elaine published 2 other books that she solo authored. By the time she was 20 years old, she had 5 books to her name. Now, despite her literary reputation and her keen intellect, and despite being awarded a scholarship to the newly opened Harvard Annex, later Radcliffe College, Elaine was still unable to afford a college education. And so she turned to what many other bright young women of the day did and sought a position as a teacher. But Elaine did not want to teach neighborhood children in the little one-room schoolhouse in Mount Washington. Inspired by a visit from the dashing General Samuel Chapman Armstrong, Elaine chose to teach at Armstrong's Hampton Institute in Virginia. Founded in 1868 with a mission to teach Black students the primarily vocational skills that Armstrong believed would help freed slaves in the burgeoning American economy, Armstrong decided to admit Native American students too, starting in 1878. Like many people in the 19th century, even those who might be thought of as progressive, Armstrong firmly believed that people of color would best be served by abandoning much of what made them different from mainstream white culture and assimilating as much as possible. So the curriculum at Hampton consisted of instruction in English only, with a combination of vocational training and academics, augmented by instruction in Christian morality, personal hygiene, and etiquette, a holistic approach encapsulated in the Hampton motto of "make haste slowly." Because almost all of the students at Hampton lived in dormitories, instructors were expected to exert their influence on them outside of the classroom as well. Education at Hampton went on 24/7, creating an environment that would prove too intensive for some of the many students who dropped out well before graduation. This philosophy of linking a skill-based education to a moral one prefigured a shift in Native American education that would occur in the early years of the 20th century, moving from the idea that education could, quote, civilize Native students to one that would give them vocational skills and help to close the gaps that separated races. This was a philosophy that the young Elaine Goodale began to embrace. Recognizing Elaine's gift with words, General Armstrong also set her to work writing for the Southern Workman, which was both a school paper where Black and Native students got skills in typesetting, and also an external publicity vehicle for the school. There, Elaine began crafting her skills as a journalist and gaining a voice and a platform for her thoughts about Native American education. But she also began to see that teaching Native American students in English only and removing children so far from their cultures, their homes, and their families was perhaps not the most impactful form of education. Instinctively, Elaine knew that getting a better understanding of the lives of her students would make her into a better teacher. Despite the English-only dictum at Hampton, Elaine began to teach herself some of her students indigenous languages by looking at books written by missionaries. She decided that to better understand her students, she actually needed to see where they had come from. It's not clear whether Elaine was being driven by an intuitive pedagogical desire, an incipient journalist curiosity, or a sense of adventure, or some combination, but her passion for traveling to the Dakota Territories convinced General Armstrong. No doubt the additional publicity that he gained from having Elaine write about her travels and the potential for this to bring Hampton more students, more donors, and more revenue also figured into his advocacy. And so in the fall of 1885, accompanied by fellow teacher Florence Bascom, a Smith College graduate, Herbert Welch, an Indian rights reformer and founder of the Indian Rights Association, and several others, Elaine traveled to the Dakota Territories, financing her journey by writing a series of articles that were published in many of the leading newspapers and magazines of the day. This trip convinced Elaine that the best kind of education for Native students would actually take place in day schools in their own communities, giving them a blend of skills that Hampton gave its students. She convinced General Armstrong, and eventually the Indian Bureau, to allow her to open such a school in White River, South Dakota. And so, along with her friend from Hampton, Laura Tileston, Elaine returned to the Dakota Territories and opened her school in 1887. Elaine recalled the, quote, two distinct worlds existing side by side, now in dramatic opposition, now intimately mixed. The world of Indians converted to Christianity and seemingly embracing Euro-American values and customs, and those who had not. As her writing from that time period and onward throughout her life made clear, this was the duality with which Elaine Goodale viewed Native people. Her belief in the necessity of assimilation as the best and most necessary way for Indian survival never changed. Elaine continued to write articles about Indian education and gained a national reputation. Her work also earned her a new position, the first supervisor of Indian education in the Dakotas, starting in 1889. Her new position filled Elaine with a kind of determination she'd never before had. Fueled by her own initiative more than by funds, powered by her beliefs more than by her means to support them, she traveled around the Great Sioux Reservation. With the authority vested in her by the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, Thomas J. Morgan, as well as with his encouragement that she continued to write articles about Indian education to share with a wide readership of potential political supporters and funders for it, Elaine made unannounced visits to schools to observe teachers. She made new hires. She organized a series of institutes for teachers to share best pedagogical practices and to set some standards among schools that had literally been the Wild West of individual methods, curricula, and teaching practices. She sent Commissioner Morgan frequent and honest reports, often illustrated with photographs that she took. And she endeared herself to elders in the Sioux communities by frequently consulting with them in their own languages. In December of 1890, her travels brought her to Pine Ridge Agency. She arrived at Pine Ridge at a very unsettled time. A series of military conflicts paired with a long and growing list of treaties broken ratcheted up tensions. Land deals that diminished the Sioux's overall territory and legislation that attempted to get Indians to use Euro-American definitions of land ownership further inflamed the embers of conflict. Since the mid-1860s, Euro-Americans had viewed the Sioux as enemies because of the many battles that had been fought. The US military responded by continuing to build forts at the outer edges of Sioux land, which of course only led to a cycle of more tensions, more conflicts, and even more tensions. And when gold had been discovered in the sacred Black Hills in 1874, white settlers poured in. There was a greater demand for railroads to be built, and consequently more environmental pressures on the land. President Ulysses S. Grant was unwilling to support the prior treaty made with the Sioux, giving them sovereignty over the Black Hills. By 1876, the Army deployed more than 15,000 soldiers in the Great Plains. It was clear that conflict would eventually erupt. Partially in reaction to the deepening despair and increased cultural anxiety among the Sioux, came word of a revivalist ceremony sweeping across Plains Native groups. The ghost dance was believed to be a way of reclaiming traditional practices to unite Native people with the spirits of their dead relatives, end American expansionism, and reclaim Native American sovereignty. But white settlers did not understand the ghost dance as an anti-colonial movement. They understood it as an anti-American movement. They understood it as an insurrection and as a threat. They brought in more military. Tensions could not have been higher when Elaine Goodale arrived in Pine Ridge in December of 1890. It was there at a tea party that Elaine Goodale and Charles Eastman met. The magnetism between them was instant and undeniable. It seemed that we were from the first mutually attracted, wrote Elaine. Others have found me cold, distant in manner, and unduly grave, but to him it seemed as if I carried on my heart the sorrows of his people. Charles later described himself as caught up in the winds of destiny. He recorded of his first impressions of Elaine. She was young for such a responsible position, but appeared equal to it in personality and experience. I thought her very dignified and reserved, but this first evening's acquaintance showed me that she was thoroughly in earnest. Her personality impressed me greatly. Within a few weeks, they had declared their love for each other and decided to marry. They would become a very rare interracial couple, especially one between a white woman and a Native man. Her family was horrified, but Elaine didn't care. What was more horrifying, actually, was the massacre that occurred at Wounded Knee Creek only a few days after Elaine and Charles became engaged. They worked side by side in a desperate and often futile attempt to save the Native victims. In the wake of the Wounded Knee massacre, both Elaine and Charles wrote pieces published in major newspapers that attempted to tell the real story of what had happened at Wounded Knee, a story that was different from the prevailing narrative coming from official Army sources. In their sorrow and their frustration, Charles decided to give up his post in the Indian Service, disgusted by the bureaucracies and broken promises. He and Elaine went to Minnesota, where he attempted to earn a living as a physician in private practice. But white patients were loath to go to an Indian doctor, and Indian patients didn't trust a doctor who practiced Western medicine. Since the Eastmans began having children around this time, they needed to bring in more money. This led to many changes in jobs for Charles. First with the YMCA, working for the Santee Sioux, trying to get funding that had been promised by the US government, for the Carlisle Indian School, and another attempt as an agency physician in Crow Creek, South Dakota. They crisscrossed the United States into and out of Indian country, leading a somewhat peripatetic existence with their growing family. It certainly could not have been easy. Encouraged by Elaine, Charles began to write. His first book, Indian Boyhood, was published in 1902. It would be followed by numerous others, some co-written with Elaine. He also began to appear as a public speaker, sometimes dressed in Euro-American Victorian clothing, sometimes in traditional Sioux apparel. His ability to tell good stories in compelling ways, as well as his good looks, made him much in demand as a speaker. Not only was he able to make some much-needed money this way, he also became one of the best-known Native Americans of his time. Elaine's own one-time promising literary career floundered as she abandoned poetry for prose and then became a mother to 6 young children. Just how much assistance she provided Charles with his own writing is a subject of much debate. She continued to write occasional newspaper pieces, mostly about topics in child rearing and Native American education, but she didn't return to writing books until 1910. The Eastmans continued to have many money problems, and it began taking a toll on their relationship. By 1903, Elaine had had enough. She decided that the family would move back to her native Massachusetts, where her father rented them a spacious house in Amherst. As it turned out, Amherst was also a town that had taken quite a bit of interest in Native American issues. The Amherst Indian Association, formed in 1890, just months before the Wounded Knee Massacre, was dedicated to, quote, do what we could toward the solution of the Indian problem. Composed of women, many of them wives and daughters of Amherst College professors, the association brought in speakers like Amelia Quinton, president of the Women's National Indian Association, Captain Richard Henry Pratt, founder of the Carlisle Indian School, and Angel DeCora, a Winnebago student at Smith College, who incidentally would later work with the Eastmans at their summer camps, to discuss aspects of Indian education, policy, and culture, and raise money for Native American causes. Merrill Gates, president of Amherst College between 1890 and 1899, also served as a commissioner on the Board of Indian Commissioners for almost 3 decades, and often spoke of his dual beliefs in land allotment and education as the best ways to help Indigenous people. Amherst's dual reputation as a town known for education and a town known for literature, as well as for civic participation and interest in Indian affairs, made this town all the more appealing to Elaine and Charles. The house Henry Goodale rented for them on Snell Street was not far from the main part of the college campus and an easy walk into town. Owned by Mary Stearns, widow of a former Amherst College president, the large rambling Victorian was shaded by tall mature trees, several porches wrapped around the home, speaking to an ease of living Elaine and Charles had not previously known. The house next door, as it turned out, was owned by Professor David Peck Todd, an astronomy professor at Amherst College, and his wife, Mabel Loomis Todd, Emily Dickinson's first editor. On the other side of the Todd's house was the newly constructed Wilder Observatory, housing the world's largest refractor telescope. It was a very interesting neighborhood and one that represented a very different environment for the Eastman family. And you can now see how my own research worlds came together. Something I discovered actually quite by chance when researching my last book and coming across a letter written by the Eastman's oldest daughter, Dora Winona, to Mabel, in which she wrote that she hoped that the noise and children climbing trees and running around the observatory that she and her siblings had done as children was not a huge disruption to the Todds. The Eastmans lived in this house until 1906, when they moved to another rental property on College Street. The house at 25 College Street, painted yellow with orange trim, had a distinctive gambrel-style roof and 2 chimneys. Today, it houses Amherst College's Keefe Health Center. Though not as large as the house on Snell Street, it still provided ample space for the large Eastman family. They were there until 1911, when unable to afford the rental on the College Street house, they moved into Lodestone, a home built by Elaine's father, Henry Sterling Goodale, which her sister Rose inherited after Henry died. Rose allowed Elaine and Charles and their family to live there rent-free. They lived at Lodestone until 1919. The Amherst years were very productive ones in terms of the Eastmans' writing. They were also very productive in terms of Charles's lecturing career. He was on the road a lot of the time. His fame continued to grow, marked by many newspaper articles and photographs of him that appeared in the press. However, neither of these ventures brought in much money, and both of them led to increasing tensions between Elaine and Charles. At the time, summer camps were taking off in the early part of the 20th century. In 1900, there were fewer than 100 camps in the United States, but by 1918, that number had increased tenfold. Many American summer camps tapped into a growing cultural nostalgia through the adoption of Native American traditions like council fires, sleeping in wigwams, and Indian storytelling, which were thought of by white people as temporarily outside of modernity, artifacts of a time gone by. The Eastmans, however, saw an opportunity in this, and they decided that this might be a very good way to make some much-needed funds. They leased a 70-acre property on the shores of Granite Lake, north of Keene, in 1915, and got to work designing a program, figuring out how to fund it and recruiting the first season of campers. Among their primary funders was Ann Morgan, daughter of financier J.P. Morgan. At first, the Eastmans planned to take only 30 girls that first summer of the camp. Elaine is quoted extensively in a promotional article that ran under the headline, "America's Only Indian Camp for Pale-Faced Girls." She suggested that not only would, quote, all the usual land and water sports, music, and dancing be featured in the camp, but also specifically genuine Indian games, dances, woodcraft, and nature lore, signaling ceremonies and council fires, along with a grand final event. These ideas became key to how the Eastmans would market their new endeavor. The first brochure for the School of the Woods, the Summer Camp with a Difference, emphasized that with 5 daughters of their own, the Eastmans were deeply sensible of the responsibility involved in the care of young girls. Other articles printed in newspapers that year picked up on this theme. For example, a lengthy article that appeared in the New York Sun under the headline, "Training American Girls in Indian Woodcraft," included a subhead exemplifying, "Guiding future mothers of the race back to the love of nature is a plan of Dr. Charles A. Eastman, who is an Indian chief." And this article that you see on the screen was from the Boston Herald. In 1916, the Eastmans launched Camp Oahe, recruiting a larger cohort of campers. The camp seemed to stave off some of the Eastmans' financial and marital problems, at least for a time. But after the summer of 1918, everything began to fall apart. Their second child, Irene Toluta, a promising soprano who just landed a job with the Metropolitan Opera, contracted the deadly flu in the pandemic of 1918 and died. They buried Irene on the Hill of Vision in back of the house that had served as Camp Oahe headquarters. This life-shattering experience was followed by another tsunamic one. A former camper named Henrietta Martindale contacted the Eastmans to let them know that she had given birth to a daughter she named Irene. A daughter, she said, who was fathered by Charles Eastman. The Eastmans' marriage was strained beyond the point of repair. Charles left Western Massachusetts in 1921 and relocated to the Midwest. Elaine moved to Northampton, where she lived with one daughter or another for the rest of her life. Charles never published another book. Elaine continued to write, but she also continued with the assimilationist views that she had always had, which by 1930 were out of step with prevailing views of the time. Charles died in 1939. Elaine lived on to 1953. The story of the Eastmans' lives, their relationship, their marriage, and its dissolution is in many ways a story that's set against and emblematic of shifting American landscapes. The stories of their lives embodied an America where ideas about race and gender were morphing, an America where notions of what it meant to be an American citizen, who deserved to be one, and how that would be expressed, were transmuting. The vision they shared early in their marriage of depicting Native American culture to a white Euro-American audience as both a way of navigating their cultural differences and as a way of preserving indigenous cultures in a changing world diverged as their relationship did. Charles and Elaine's journeys into and out of Indian country, as symbolic as they were actual, represented a vision of a Native America and of a United States of America, familiar but unknown, entwined but separated, inextricable yet never fully joined, just like Elaine and Charles themselves. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to study.
They've written several books. Was Ted Sargent wrote a book, didn't he?
Ted Sargent wrote a biography of Elaine Goodale.
And then there was another one too. That I've read over the years.
There was, Elaine wrote a memoir which was not published during her lifetime, but which was subsequently published by University of Nebraska Press in 1984, I'm going to say, called Sister to the Sioux. And there have been a couple of biographies written of Charles Eastman. So of course what I've tried to do in my book is to write about both of them, because I really found that you can't really know Elaine without knowing Charles, and you can't really know Charles without knowing Elaine. But that proved to be a really challenging thing to do. One of the reasons that it proved challenging, and I just want to pick up on something Gigi asked me earlier, it's about where are the sources for this book. So in contrast, some of you may remember when I talked about Mabel Loomis Todd and Millicent Todd Bingham. I said the big challenge I had was that there were so many sources, right. 721 boxes at Yale. And with the Eastmans, there's not nearly comparable sort of material. With the Eastmans, there are materials at Smith College that are collected there. However, Elaine severely curated the materials that are there. After her relationship with Charles fell apart, she really didn't want to keep anything that related to him. And so, for example, there are no pictures of their wedding. There are very few pictures of him at all. Their letters are curtailed. And Charles Eastman didn't leave very much of a paper trail at all. There are some materials at Dartmouth in the Rauner Library. There are his published works, his books, some of the articles that he wrote, some letters that he wrote that are scattered in archives across the country. But there are no diaries for either one of them. And it was very challenging to try to think about how to understand the core of these people, because they left behind so little of sort of their innermost thoughts. However, Elaine, late in life, did write not late in life, throughout her life, she wrote a series of letters to her sister Rose, which are fascinating letters. And while Elaine destroyed Rose's letters to her, so they don't exist in the collection at Smith College, what Elaine didn't know, couldn't have known, was that Rose would save all of her letters to Rose. And these letters were subsequently donated to Smith College, so they really provide, I think, the best insights into what Elaine was sort of honestly and authentically thinking at the time. And there are some fascinating things, not just about her relationship with Charles, but things that she thought about her children, and things that she thought about her writing, and things that she thought about her siblings or her parents. And so there are some ways of getting at this, but it certainly posed a very different set of challenges. The other challenge I had with the resources for this book is that they're scattered throughout the country. So, in fact, I relied on things in 14 different states and 4 different countries. And I started doing this research during the pandemic. However, that actually turned out to be more of a boon than a bust, because it turned out that even though I couldn't travel to archives, archivists, who are always the unsung heroes for biographers, were still working. They were working remotely, and they were more than happy to field queries like mine and sort of track down things and pass them along to me digitally. And so was actually able to, weirdly, I was able to do the research for this book very quickly because of the pandemic.
Hi. My husband and I went to Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
We went to Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Yes. Could you describe your understanding of what the Indian schools were like
Yeah,
from a student's perspective?
Sure. So the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania was founded by Richard Henry Pratt, who was another ex-Army officer who really believed that the path forward for Native people was assimilation. And it was opened in former Army barracks. He ran the school, sort of like a military school. People had to wear uniforms. They insisted that Native pupils, when they arrived, had to cut their hair. And Pratt was also just sort of a master of media manipulation. So he did things like, among other things, he would take these quote-unquote before and after photos, some of which became really famous photos, and and they were doctored photos too. So they sort of manipulated the photos using whatever technology was available at the time to sort of make the skin seem darker in the before-ish photo and make it seem lighter after the student had his hair cut and was quote-unquote civilized by the education that they received at the Carlisle Indian School. The Eastmans were there briefly. They both got jobs there. Elaine got a job working as sort of the editor of the newspaper there because, once again, Pratt sort of recognized, here's somebody who knows how to write, and thought that this would be a good external publicity vehicle for Carlisle. And Charles was given the job of what was called an outing agent. And so what they did, this was another one of Pratt's quote-unquote innovations, where he believed that another way to help assimilate Native students would be in the summer when school was not in session, to get these students positions with white families doing manual labor. And Charles's job was to try to find positions for some of these students. The Eastmans were also kind of held up as, I don't know, almost like room parents at the school. So they were there with their 6 kids. Well, I guess they didn't have 6 kids then, they had 5 kids then. And there's some interesting things in the newspaper clippings from the school about the Eastman children who would run around with the students at the school. And the Carlisle Indian School, I can't remember what year it closed, but Dickinson College launched along with some significant external funding, they have been digitizing materials that they have from the Carlisle Indian School. And you can see a lot of this stuff online, a lot of the newspapers, and some of these photographs, which are just really sort of extraordinary testaments to the way that Euro-Americans, sort of what they thought was best practice in education for Native pupils. And then, of course, the other reason the Carlisle Indian School has been in the news recently is that many, many Native students died there and were buried on the grounds there. Some of them in unmarked graves, and tribal members from many different groups have been coming to Carlisle, Pennsylvania to identify, reclaim some of the bodies of children who died and were buried there and bring them back home. So that's the other reason that Carlisle has been in the news recently.
Didn't the athlete Thorpe come from it? Go to school there?
Yes.
Can't remember. his
Jim
first-
Thorpe.
Jim Thorpe.
Yeah.
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 Hi, Andy.
Hi, Julie. Thanks for all this. It's so great.
Thanks for
I
coming.
was stuck on the idea of the discrimination against Charles practicing physician by both the Native community and the white community. I'm wondering about any either legal or social discrimination they experienced as a couple within it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, as I mentioned, the Eastmans were a rare interracial couple, and rare in two senses. One, that there weren't that many interracial marriages at all, and where there were many more that were between white men and Native women than the other way around. So, and it's interesting, this is where some of Elaine's sort of inner insights from her letters to Rose come into play here, because Elaine, in some of her published works, we would just say, my children didn't experience any discrimination. She had 6 interracial kids. It's hard to believe that she didn't think about her children that way, but she really didn't. She thought of her children as being more white than Native. How do we know this? Well, number one, she listed them as white on the Amherst 1910 census. She really did not, either she didn't see or she didn't acknowledge things that her own children were experiencing, undoubtedly. The other thing that I just found extraordinary from researching the story of the Eastmans was the other reason that it was sort of an easier job to find out things about them than it might have been is because of the digitization of long-defunct newspapers. So I was able to find amazing things from newspapers across the United States. And when the Eastmans were written about, which they were very frequently, it's just extraordinary to see some of the ways that they were talked about. There's one horrendous article that I believe appeared in a newspaper in Minnesota, which was talking about Elaine holding her baby, and they describe sort of this, these are not my words, these are from the newspaper, the pretty petite Elaine crooning to her young infant who had the face of an old squaw, and just sort of using this horrible racist language. Now, surely Elaine and Charles read these newspaper articles. Surely they did. It must have hurt them. But she didn't give us a lot to go on there, and he didn't leave anything. But I would have to say, from reading this stuff, of course, through the lens of 21st century perspective, you read it, you just cringe when you read some of the stuff written about them. And think about, what it must have meant as an additional stressor in their marriage. Think about what it must have meant as an additional stressor to Elaine, for whom motherhood did not exactly come easily, shall we say. That, she had these 6 biracial children, and she wasn't really thinking about them that way, wasn't really acknowledging that way. So, it's a great question, and I absolutely think that this was a major thing that was going on in their world, in their relationship, but we don't have a lot of written evidence about it.
Is there any information on the Amherst Indian Association?
There is, and if you go upstairs into special collections, they have it. Yes, and I have to thank my dear friend Cindy Harbison for finding some stuff for me. And they also have some stuff over at Amherst College in the archives and special collections. So yes, there is some information about it.
Did you have any contact with the children, the grandchildren?
The descendants. So that's a great question. No, and the answer is really no. I have made a couple of attempts which have not panned out. You can imagine with 6 children, so not all of the 6 children went on to have children themselves, but several of them did. There are a lot of Eastman descendants. I mean, I've done a little bit of genealogical work, so I have some sense of how vast this clan is and how it's spread out across the United States, but I haven't myself taken the next steps that I still would like to do.
Was one of the 6 children a male?
Yes,
And
was one boy.
And what became of him?
Okie. Well, he had also sort of a tragic life. So again, sort of according to his mother, who on the one hand was very protective of him, on the other hand thought that he didn't really amount to as much as she thought he might. He joined the Navy, much to his parents' horror, right at the beginning of World War I. He was deployed overseas for a time. He thankfully came back all right. He kind of drifted around. He never really finished his education. He ended up going out to the Midwest. He lived in Detroit. He worked for the Kelvinator refrigeration company, doing advertising for them. He married a white woman that Elaine despised. There's another problem there. And he died tragically young. So Elaine actually had 3 children who predeceased her. So you can imagine that, that was also horrible.
Hi. This is amazing, really fascinating. There's so many directions you can sort of think about it and take it further even though this is amazing. So I have a couple questions since we're talking about kids. I read a little bit about Henrietta and that Charles rejected the child, but something about Elaine wanted the child to be raised by Elaine, to be part of her.
Right. Well, so I don't want to give away too much of this,
I
but
know.
I mean, this yes.
Just curious.
It has to be published first. But Claire's right. The story of this out of wedlock baby is a fantastic soap opera-ish story. I mean, it's really worthy of a Lifetime movie. So I'll give you the brief précis here. So at first, as you can imagine, Elaine did not want to believe that this baby was Charles's baby. She was pissed. But she was more angry that Charles did not want to accept any responsibility for the child than she was about the fact that he had fathered a child out of wedlock. And Elaine did correspond with Henrietta's sister. She also corresponded with Henrietta. She traveled to Chicago, where she met Henrietta and the child. Elaine, there was a time that Henrietta wanted Elaine and Charles to raise the child as their own, which was out of the question. That wasn't going to happen. Let me just say, and to whet your appetite for this a little bit, by saying that Henrietta had a lot of mental health issues, and the story about what happened to her and what happened to that baby is also, it's a really interesting story. I've tracked some of it and written about it in my book. Thank you for that question.
One more question.
I just have 2 quick questions. First, you said that you worked across, I think, 12 states when you were doing the research and you were getting your archival materials. So so my question is, was this based on where the Eastmans were traveling, and what did you learn from the archival materials from these different places? And then secondly, you mentioned General Armstrong appointing Elaine for this position in these various schools. Is there any kind of correspondence between the general and Elaine that might tell us something about how she was thinking about things, or were they just reports from the general?
Yeah, those are great questions. I'll answer the second one first. I have not found a lot of materials between Armstrong and Elaine. There's some sort of like really ecstatic stuff that Elaine writes about him, but I haven't found, I didn't try to track down a lot of his materials. I did find there are some things at what is now Hampton University archives. And in answer to your other question about, that's one of the really cool things about doing archival research, I think, is that you start going down these archival rabbit holes. So, for example, one of the things that Charles Eastman did was he was somebody who was foundational in the founding of the Boy Scouts. They used a lot of, Seton used a lot of Charles's information. So I started tracking that down, and it turns out that the National Boy Scout Museum is in Cimarron, New Mexico. Go figure. So, you know, I was in touch with them about whether there's any correspondence between Seton and Charles. I found up in New Hampshire at the Cheshire County Historical Society in Keene, near where the Eastmans had their summer camp in Munsonville, that they have a number of materials there. So, you know, you start finding little things, or another interesting archival rabbit hole that I went down was one of Charles's many jobs later in life was that he was hired by the Indian Service to try to find out where Sacagawea was actually buried.
Oh my gosh.
Because there were two different stories about where she was buried, one of which would have had her living to over 90 years of age, and one of which had her dying as a young woman. So Charles is sort of going around the country in Wyoming and Oklahoma, mostly trying to figure out, you know, where did Sacagawea really die? So at the same time that he's doing this, there is a woman at the University of Wyoming named Grace Hebard, who was very involved with the burgeoning suffragette movement in the United States. And the suffragettes, white suffragettes, saw Sacagawea as some sort of role model, right? This was somebody who was literally leading men places, right? And so Grace Hebard wanted to know what Charles was up to. You know, was he going to write a competing book to the one she wanted to write? Was he finding things that she wasn't able to find because she was white and he was native? So there is some fascinating correspondence that I tracked down between Charles and Grace Hebard that's at the University of Wyoming. So you never know where these archival rabbit holes are going to take you. It's a fascinating journey. It can take a lot of time, and sometimes there's payoff and sometimes there isn't. Thank you for that question.
Well, thank you so much, Julie. And I wish you could say to us that your book is being published in, I don't know, May, and will be available, whatever.
I wish I could too.
So what do you, next year sometime, or are you still?
Well, I will tell you that right now this book has no home.
Oh.
So the manuscript is finished. It is sitting at 14 different editors' offices right now. Over the last year and a half, as my agent has tried to sell it, she has found that very little is moving other than Trump tell-all books. So, you know, you as the reading audience need to express a desire to read some serious books, and maybe things like this will get published.
Do you have a working title?
That's my working title, Crossing Indian Country.
Okay, yeah.
Well, gosh, good luck, and thank you for sharing this with us. Come back in 2 weeks. We have Bob Drinkwater, who will be talking, giving us more stories from the West Cemetery, and so same time, same place, and come join us. And if you're not members of the Historical Society, please consider doing so, and you can sign up online and process it electronically. But thank you for coming, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.